My name is Bill Marino, and today I'm going to be talking about the EU AI Act. How many of you, just show of hands, have been spending some time thinking about this or looking at it? Okay, some hands, but I also see a lot of newcomers. This is great because we're going to talk about it in very simple terms. We're going to talk about what it means for you. Something I learned in my startup days is that you need to convince the audience in the first slide or two why what you're about to say matters to them. So I'm going to try to do that in the next two slides. The first reason I think this is important has to do with money. Violating the EU AI Act can mean penalties of up to 35 million euros, or get this one, 7% of global revenues. So that's a pretty big deal. So I think that's a pretty good reason to pay attention to what I'll be talking about. Even if you're not operating, doing any AI in the EU, the second reason to maybe pay attention is something that's called the Brussels effect. This is a pattern whereby what happens in the EU with regard to regulation. So what happens with the EU regulation tends to impact global standards. This is pretty much what happened with data privacy laws. The EU came out with GDPR, and that influenced California and other places when they went to create their own data privacy regulations. So what happens in the EU today may very well happen tomorrow, wherever you are. A little bit about myself. I am a PhD student in the Department of Computer Science and Technology at the University of Cambridge, where my focus is on responsible and regulation compliant AI. In the past, I was a lawyer, then I was a startup founder, and also an AI product manager at Adobe and Stability AI. Here's how we're going to spend our time together. I'm going to first talk about the EU AI Act, the AIA, you might hear me call it. We'll talk about the principles behind the AIA. We'll talk a little bit about its specific requirements. We'll then spend about 15 minutes talking about how you can get ready, practical steps you could start to take probably now. And then we'll try to leave about 10 minutes for Q&A at the very end. So let's talk about the AIA at a high level. It is a first of its kind comprehensive AI regulation. It contains harmonized requirements for AI systems and models in the EU. It just entered into force in August, which is a way of saying that it's finalized. And its provisions will start to come into effect, which is a way of saying you need to comply with them, starting in February. Some amongst the provisions that come into effect starting in February are the provisions that we're going to talk about around prohibited practices. So those are some of the first things that you really need to start thinking about. Other provisions will gradually roll out through 2027, and after that, you'll have to comply with the entire act. What is in scope of this act? Well, there has to be some connection between your AI and the EU market. That could be because you, as an operator, a provider, or a deployer of AI, and we're going to talk about what those roles are based in the EU. It could be because you're placing this AI on the market in the EU, which is a way of saying making it available for the first time in the EU. It could be because you're putting this AI into service in the EU, which means you're supplying it for use in some product used by others, or for use by others internally for the first time in the EU. So there has to be that connection, first of all. To whom does this apply? The Act spells out different roles within the AI ecosystem, and each has its own responsibilities. We're going to hear later on that some have heavier burdens than others. If you are a provider, regardless of where you are located, if you're provider means developer of AI, basically, developing AI under your own name. If you're a provider, regardless of where you're located, these rules are going to apply to you. If you're an EU-based deployer, a deployer is someone who is using AI developed by others, either in your products or just internally. These rules are going to apply to you. There's other operator roles that have obligations as well. We won't talk about these quite as much. Importers, distributed distributors, product manufacturers. Whether or not your location matters varies according to the role, but these other roles do have obligations as well. What AI is, let me just make sure I didn't skip a slide, okay. What AI is affected. So the Act's requirements primarily concern two forms of AI, I like to call them. That's my own terminology. AI systems and general purpose AI models. Each has their own requirements that have to be satisfied. It's really important to get our minds around these, so let's sort of pick through these carefully. So the first form of AI that has some requirements around it are what's called AI systems. Now, the Act defines these. I wish there was a short and sweet definition of these. Unfortunately, there isn't. So bear with me. Let's walk through this definition of AI systems together. The Act defines an AI system as a machine-based system designed to operate with varying levels of autonomy that may exhibit adaptiveness after deployment, and that for explicit or implicit objectives, infers from the input it receives how to generate outputs such as predictions, content recommendations, or decisions. It's pretty wordy. I think all of us wish there was something more succinct. If it sounds a little nebulous to you, you're not alone. We're all excited to have regulators and courts in the coming years provide a little more detail about what is an AI system and what isn't. There seems to be consensus that if you have a system with machine learning, that's an AI system. There also seems to be consensus that conventional software does not fit the bill. But between those, where the exact threshold is, we're all sort of waiting for answers, and we're going to have to see. It may, for example, include AI systems that are not based on machine learning. Now let's talk a little bit about this second form, general purpose AI models. The Act defines these as models, not systems, but models that display significant generality and are capable of competently performing a wide range of distinct tasks. I read this as what we call foundation models out there. I think it's safe to do that for the time being until we get more clarification. Let me tell you a little bit about why this second form came about. It was later in the legislative process, and we'll talk a little bit more about this shortly, but here's a little bit of a spoiler. Midway through the legislative process, ChatGPT happened, basically. And I think everyone realized that these sort of models, we probably ought to regulate them in some way, but this risk-based approach, which is intended use-driven, I'm going to talk a little bit more about it shortly, it kind of falls apart for general purpose models like these. So I think everyone realized that we needed a new set of rules for these foundational models, GPAI models. So that's that second form that has its own requirements. If you're looking for a convenient little heuristic to use to figure out what's in the AI system bucket and what's in the general purpose AI model bucket, maybe this helps. This is from a great paper that I like, 2004, Yorka et al. ChatGPT would be an example of an AI system, the interface, the underlying model, everything. Whereas GPT 3.5, or in some cases 4.0, would be the general purpose AI model powering that AI system. Maybe that's a heuristic that helps you understand what's in each bucket. Now, the Act has some very important exemptions. If you fit into one of these exemptions, there may be a complete exemption for you and the Act just doesn't apply, or you may have a reduced burden. So it's really important to think about whether you might fall into any of these exemptions. There's a total exemption for scientific research. This is anything developed and put into service for the sole purpose of scientific research and development. There's a total exemption for pre-market research, testing, or development activity, anything happening in the lab before this thing actually hits the market. There's a total exemption for AI systems, any AI systems released under free and open source licenses. By contrast, there is only a partial exemption for open source general purpose AI models. only some of the requirements do not apply. There's also a higher bar to meet that open source criteria for if you're a general purpose AI model. You have to open your model weights, open your documentation, slightly higher bar. So if you're not exempted, if you don't fit into any of those exemptions, what requirements apply? We're going to go through these in a pretty granular fashion. I found it hard to internalize all of them, and one thing that helps me internalize them is to think about the legislative process and the sort of big building blocks that accrued one on top of the other during this legislative process. If you think about these big building blocks and you try to sort of remember these, I think you'll start to internalize the more specific requirements that we're going to go through in a moment. So let's just kind of talk briefly about the legislative process of this act. It all started back in 2018. The EU formed a high-level expert group to start to think about how AI might be regulated in the EU. This high-level expert group issued a report in 2019, Ethics Guidelines for Trustworthy AI. This was heavily influenced by an earlier report from the OECD, and it basically outlined a number of high-level responsible AI principles that they thought should guide the regulation of AI in the EU. So let's just click through these really quickly. These high-level principles that they thought were important are the following. Human agency and oversight. So humans should control and be able to oversee AI systems and models. Our models should be technically robust, fault tolerant, and they should be safe. They shouldn't cause harm. We should ensure privacy, including through data governance. We want transparency, right? We want to understand how these systems work. We want to safeguard diversity. We want to fight discrimination. We want to ensure fairness, that these models treat everyone equally. And we want to safeguard society and the environment, right? We want these models to work not just for all of humankind, but for our environment, for other species even. And last but not least, we want accountability. We want these models and systems to be auditable so we know that people are following these principles. So that was sort of the first building block in this legislative process, these trustworthy AI guidelines. In 2020, the European Union Commission issues its white paper on AI, and that adds a second building block that's really important to understanding all of the requirements of the Act, and that is the risk-based approach. So we're going to have different rules according to the level of risk associated with your AI model or system. Specifically, what the Commission said is the new regulatory framework for AI should not be excessively prescriptive so that it could create a disproportionate burden, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. To strike this balance, the Commission is of the view that it should follow a risk-based approach. So we start with these important trustworthy AI principles. We add this risk-based approach. And then last but not least is the thing that I mentioned earlier. After the EC proposes the first draft of the Act, after the Commission proposes the first draft of the Act, ChatGPT drops, the world changes, we realize we need additional rules for this other type of AI, these general purpose AI models. So those are the three building blocks that get layered one on top of each other and help, I hope, help you understand the requirements that we're about to talk about. I'm going to get into the specific requirements, starting with AI systems. We mentioned this idea of a risk-based approach, right? So here's your sort of risk pyramid. Depending on the risk level of your AI system, we're going to have different requirements. Let's click through these really quickly, and then we'll go through, each one by one in more detail. If your AI system falls into this category of minimal risk, the lowest risk category, you're going to have pretty thin requirements that you have to satisfy. We're going to talk about it. It's really just one requirement. If you're in the next category up, limited risk, and we'll talk about how you get into that category, you're just going to have a few requirements, and they mostly concern transparency around your system. If you fall into the high-risk AI system category, to be frank, there's just a lot of requirements that you're going to have to meet, and we're going to try to go through those. Last but not least, if you fall into the highest category of risk, which is unacceptable risk, it's just going to be prohibited. Just can't do it. So let's start at the bottom of that pyramid and kind of work our way up. If you fall into that minimal category of risk, regardless of whether you're a provider or a deployer, they both have obligations. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to ensure that anyone at your company who is involved in the AI systems operation has some level of AI literacy. So this means you have to assess everyone's knowledge, you have to conduct training programs to fill any gaps, and you have to document this whole process. That's pretty much your main requirements if you're in that lowest category of risk. Let's click up one level of risk. If you are in the limited risk category, you're going to have some requirements, mostly around transparency. How do you get into this category? The Act is actually pretty clear about this. It describes the specific systems that are in this second category up. These are systems that involve direct user interaction, that are used to create synthetic media, that have some risk of being used to create deep fakes. So if you meet any of these criteria, you're going to have some more transparency-related requirements, notifying users that they're interacting with AI, adding watermarks to synthetic media that are generated with your AI, things like that. Now let's talk about the high-risk category. How do you get into this category? The Act is actually pretty clear about this, which is helpful. There's about 9 criteria that will get you into the high-risk AI category. And then there's one criteria that will pop you back out as an exception. So these 9 criteria are the following. I'm going to skip through these really quickly. If you are a product that is already regulated in the EU, or your AI system is a safety feature of a product that's already regulated, you're in the high-risk category. Certain biometrics use cases, safety components of critical infrastructure, certain educational and employment use cases, essential services, both private and public, certain law enforcement use cases, anything with migration, courts, the democratic process. These are all going to put you into the high-risk AI category. If you can prove, however, that despite being in one of these categories, your AI system does not pose a significant risk of harm to health, safety, or fundamental rights, you can pop back out and get out of the high-risk AI category. If you're in this category and you're a provider, an AI developer, you're going to have a serious amount of requirements in front of you. Some of those are organizational requirements, okay? These are things you need to start to implement in your organization. A quality management system. This is a system that's going to ensure compliance with this regulation via policies and procedures. A risk management system. This is a separate system that's going to be focused on identifying and potentially mitigating any of the risks. Last but not least, you're going to have to implement data governance and management practices. These are going to have to be designed to ensure certain qualities of your data sets, your training sets, your validation and test sets. We'll talk a little bit more about what those qualities are in a second. In addition to those organizational requirements, if you're a high-risk AI system, there are more specific goals that you're going to have to satisfy, okay? When it comes to your data, you're going to have to achieve certain qualities, again, with your training, validation, and test sets. They're going to have to be, for the intended use case, adequately relevant, representative, and complete, reasonably free from errors, and they're going to have to possess the appropriate statistical properties with regard to the target users. So this has to do with bias, right? You're also going to have to produce a lot of documentation. This is not just for regulators, it's also for anyone who's going to be deploying the AI system that you've developed. This documentation has to do with the intended purposes that you foresee, the training data, training process, the evaluation process, human oversight features that you've added. You're going to have to start doing record keeping. This is a way of saying logging. This is to help monitor for risks to see if they actually do precipitate. You're going to have to put human oversight mechanisms into place for your AI system. The system has to be able to be effectively overseen by natural persons. Those people have to be able to correctly interpret the outputs. So this speaks to interpretability, explainability. The models inside your system have to be appropriately accurate, robust, fault tolerant, and they have to reflect a requisite level of cybersecurity, resilience to unauthorized attempts to alter their use, outputs, or performance by exploiting system vulnerabilities. On top of all that, you are going to have to run a compliance assessment. You can do it yourself. You can grade your own homework in this case, and there's an argument about whether that's the right way to do it, but you can, as of today, do this yourself. You can also have a third party do it, but you have to do an assessment that assesses whether or not you're satisfying all these requirements as a high-risk AI system provider. And you're also going to have to register your system with the EU. If you are the deployer, so not the provider, but the deployer of a high-risk AI system, you have slightly lighter requirements, but they're still there. You have to follow the instructions of use shared by the provider of that system, by its developer. You have to ensure the input data that your users are passing into the system align with the intended purpose that was spelled out by the provider. You have to put human oversight and monitoring mechanisms in place, just like providers. Let's just talk about this highest category of risk for AI systems, and then we'll move on and we'll talk about the requirements for general purpose AI models. If you're in this highest category, unacceptable risk, which again, these are just prohibited, just can't do them. How do you know if you're in your category, this category? Once again, the Act is helpful here. It spells out specifically what is and isn't prohibited. I'm not going to go through these in great detail. Manipulative systems, deceptive systems, systems that exploit people's vulnerabilities, crime prediction based on personal traits. So these are deemed to be so risky that you just can't do them. Let's talk quickly about general purpose AI models and the requirements around them, and then we'll move on to some practical advice. So with general purpose AI models, we don't have really this highest level of risk, this prohibited tranche. Instead, we just have limited risk, you might call it, and high risk. And for limited risk general purpose AI models, it's really just transparency requirements. For high risk, by the way, the phrasing of risk is a little different. You're going to see it in a second. It's called systemic risk. If you're a model with high enough risk, then you're going to have transparency requirements plus a little bit more. So the dividing line here with risk is around this concept of systemic risk. And let me just describe what this means. The Act defines it, but then it also provides a couple proxies that we can look at to decide if systemic risk is or isn't there. The Act defines systemic risk as potentially having a significant, models that potentially have a significant impact on the EU market due to their reach or actual or reasonably foreseeable negative effects on public health, safety, public security, or society. If that seems a little bit ambiguous to you, I don't blame you. Once again, the Act does provide a couple proxies. So if these exist by default, you have systemic risk. One is if your model shows high impact capabilities based on benchmarks that are out there. If you're like me, this also sounds a little bit nebulous, right? So the Act provides one more proxy that is actually a pretty clear line in the sands. If the compute that you consume during the entire training process for this model is greater than 10 to the 25th floating point operations, then you are presumed to have systemic risk. There's a whole debate about having a hard line like this and whether it makes sense, whether it's going to be outdated in a year or two. But as of right now, that specific line in the sand is in the Act. So if you are a general purpose AI model You don't displace systemic risk. Your obligations really just have to do with transparency. You have to document intended tasks, training process and data, compute used to train, known or estimated energy consumption, a few other things. You have to actually publicize these. If you fall into the systemic risk category, you have all those obligations, some additional transparency obligations, documentation obligations, but you also have to evaluate and then mitigate any of the systemic risks that your model might possess. You have to report any incidents that speak to these risks to the EU, and there's additional cybersecurity measures. You've heard me reference a couple of times during this talk language that I feel is a little nebulous. I'm not the only one. We're all looking for a little bit more clarification. That will come from regulators, from courts, and hopefully it'll come a little bit sooner because the EU has these technical standard setting entities, loosely comparable to NIST in the USA, that are going to take the language of the Act, break it down into more concrete standards. If you, as an AI operator, follow these standards, you're by default presumed to comply with the Act. And ideally, these are going to give us a little bit more of a palpable sense of some of these requirements. So we're all excited to see those come down, maybe in the next year or two. So let's talk a little bit about how to get ready for the Act. I'll speed this up a little bit. I think I'm running a little bit behind. As a preliminary step, I think everyone should probably do this. Work with a professional, a lawyer, a regulation expert to assess whether or not any of your AI activities are in scope, potentially in scope, of the Act. Remember, that's a function not only of your location, but what you're putting on the market or into service in the EU. It's also a function of your particular role in the AI ecosystem. Once you do that, you may decide it's worth creating an AI inventory. This is something you might want to do anyways. We've talked a lot about the EU AI Act here. There's other regulations that may come down the pipeline. That may be a reason that you create an AI inventory, or you may just want to do it. There's a lot of software out there that can help. If you Google AI inventory, AI model inventory, you'll get a lot of different options. You may want to do that as the first step. You may then want to go through each entry in your AI inventory, determine if it's a prohibited practice, or conversely, if it might be exempted from the Act. Determine the form, AI system, general purpose AI model. Determine the risk level, high risk, minimum risk. And then based on all those other determinations, start to follow the relevant requirements. You're going to have to, in the foreseeable future, have to satisfy them. If you want to be a little bit more proactive, I think it's okay to start to design for compliance. Start to choose or create data sets and develop models that could be compliant with different requirements if they need to be. Think about implementing human oversight mechanisms, logging, some of those Article 50 measures we talked about, watermarking, telling your users that they're interacting with AI. I don't think it's too soon to implement those things. I think there's a lot of benefits outside of regulation. Maybe start to implement some of these organizational practices that we talked about, data governance and data management, risk management, things like that. Last but not least, I think if you want to be proactive, it's a good time to start to invest in documentation across your ML projects and efforts, across the ML lifecycle. One way to do this, and I'm really excited about, are transparency artifacts. You may have heard of these: model cards, data cards. The Act actually specifically shouts out these kinds of transparency artifacts and encourages providers to create them for deployers. This is a subject of a lot of my research lately. How do we make these more computational so that we can maybe automate some regulatory analyses and so forth? That paper, by the way, is on archive if you want to check it out. The last thing I'll say is it's not too early to start to think about how the EU AI Act and other forthcoming regulation affects your strategy, right? This, going forward, should be part of the calculus that you undergo when you're thinking about entering a new market, or what products you're going to put on the market. We talked about the different requirements for AI systems and GPAI models and the different requirements for each tranche of risk inside those two categories. We also talked about categories of AI where you just don't have requirements, like if you're exempted. So there are stark differences between these requirements and the regulatory burden that you have. So when you go to put something new on the market, you might start to work this into that calculus, right? By the EU's own estimates, if you have a high-risk AI system that cost 170,000 euros to create, on average, 6 to 10% of that should be budgeted for compliance with the EU AI Act. So that 10% is pretty serious. So this is really something that you might start to build into your strategy, your product strategy, your business strategy. Think about the target use cases for AI systems in the EU market. That is something I would advise everyone to start doing going forward. The target use cases, as you saw, sort of define the risk level, and the risk level defines the requirements that you have to meet, and there can be stark differences. So start to think hard about those use cases you're targeting with your products, your AI products. Start to think about your operator role. Are you a provider? Are you a deployer? Again, there were stark differences in the requirements. And last but not least, start to think about the form of AI. Are you putting an AI system on the market in the EU? Are you putting a general purpose AI model in the EU? There are stark differences in the requirements, and you're going to want to build this all into your strategy going forward. I think I left a couple minutes for discussion. Do we have 10 minutes? We have 10 minutes, okay. And I need to put the headphones on so I can hear everyone. And we're going to have a handheld mic that we're going to pass around.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for the great talk.
Thank you.
And this is on AI Denmark webinar, so we can look back on the slides later?
I think that's right.
Okay, great. I was curious if you think, from your professional opinion, from your research, does it make sense to register all AI models in the EU, not just the high risk, so that we can track over time with the history, how we can mitigate risk moving forward, because a lot of us don't know how the software is going to be used, with open source especially, how the data set will change over time. So how do we mitigate those kind of unknown risks?
Let me make sure I understand your question. Thank you for your question, first of all. Let me make sure I understand. You, in terms of the law itself, you could see some benefit in requiring everyone to register their AI models, regardless of risk level. So today, we talked about the fact that really only if you're in that high-risk AI category do you need to register your AI system with the EU. But you're maybe interested in a world where all AI systems, or maybe all AI systems and models, need to be registered. So we can, we can have some accountability of who's working on what and how risk evolves over time. Is that the question?
Yes, and also your professional opinion on should those kind of models that are basically out in the wild, interacting with the public, not internal, should they also be registered with the EU?
It's a great question. There's a trade-off here. So I think surely, transparency is a good thing, right? We all know transparency is a good thing. It's good to know if people are working on things behind closed doors that could be risky. The trade-off is that it creates a burden, a regulatory burden on folks who, may have a lower risk level. The act, and I think I highlighted a quote where the drafters of this act were very explicit that they wanted, they didn't want to overburden startups, and especially startups and small and medium-sized enterprises with too much regulation. So the risk-based system is a way of kind of negotiating that. I could see a world where if everyone has to register their AI system, that starts to create a bit of a burden, even for people who are developing models that are very unlikely to have any risk. I've done a lot of work in the creative space, and you're sometimes working on models where it's not obvious that any risk could precipitate. And this is very different than if you're working on medicine or critical infrastructure. So I think it's a great question. I don't think there's a right answer that stands out. I guess my concern would be that we start to sort of lose the trade-off that's in place with the risk system. But it's a great system. I don't know what the right answer is. And by the way, as this act gets out there and we see how people respond to it, how businesses respond, we're going to get a sense of whether these requirements are too burdensome or hit the sweet spot. So I think this is a great question. How I feel about it might evolve as we see this stuff get out in the wild and how much it's really costing people and the actual burden it puts on businesses. So thank you for a great question. Yes, back there, yes.
Yeah. Hello.
Hi.
I come from medical background.
Great.
I just want clarification. For instance, when you are using this AI diagnostics, and maybe there is a mistake or misdiagnosis. So, like in the ethical part, who is responsible? A hospital, developer, or the use of the system? The creator of that.
Let me make sure I understand the question. It's a great question. Thank you for your question. So, we have a hospital that's using an AI system. Okay. Something goes wrong. Unfortunately, someone gets there's a bad prediction, it hurts somebody. Something we all want to avoid. Who might be responsible? So, in terms of the EU AI Act, this is really phrased as forward-thinking or forward-looking, I should say, obligations, right? So, in that case, and this is a great example, and I really appreciate the question. The hospital is pretty unlikely to have been the developer of the AI model, unless they're a very well-funded hospital network. We have some of those in the US, but I would say odds are this system was developed by somebody else. Large tech company, startup who's doing stuff in the health space. Most likely as the AI as the AI developer, they would be the provider and they would have most of the burden of satisfying these requirements that we talked about, including making sure that model, which is, has some probability of being in the high-risk AI category. So they have to, look at risk in the training data. They have to make sure that the model is accurate. So they have all those obligations up front, okay? The hospital in this case would probably be the deployer. They still have some obligations for a system like this. We talked about a few of those. They have to make sure the inputs are the right ones that the provider expected and things like that. But as a rough rule of thumb in a situation like this, the developer is going to have more upfront requirements to make sure that this system, before it goes out into the wild, has minimized a lot of these risks. Great question. I really appreciate it. How are we doing on time?
We have about 5 minutes left, but I'm going to use the last minute to...
Okay, so maybe one more question,
Yes.
quick question.
And also, before we dive into that, we do have the opportunity to meet the speaker over in the light blue pavilion over here
Yeah,
afterwards. So come talk to
Sounds fun.
Bill.
I'd love to meet you all. Please come.
Hi. In the beginning, you talked about human agency as one of the goals behind this legislation.
Yeah.
And I wonder how do you see that reflected in the result, the actual legislation? Because you're talking so much about human oversight, but you also talk about transparency. But what about agency? How is that reflected? Do you think it's okay the way it has been reflected in the legislation?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. Let me think about that one. Human agency in particular. I think that human agency and human oversight, there's a lot of overlap there, right? I think we, in some cases, for example, something that's more on the human agency side is we want to know when we're interacting with AI systems, right? We want to be empowered to know if this is AI that's making decisions or not. We want to be empowered with some insight into decisions that really affect our lives, right? Financial, medical predictions, these are things that really affect us. So we want to have some insight into the decisions and how they came about. So I think some of these other requirements, you're not going to see a headline in the Act that says human agency, but I think it does filter into some of these other requirements, like the transparency requirements in particular. It's a great question.
So I'm going to take one question from online from
Okay.
from Vice. He
An
says,
online question.
"Thank you for a great talk. Would you say that, for example, an AI system that performs defect detection in manufacturing and it inspects a safety component, let's say a car belt buckle, is it high risk or a minimal risk system? What if it inspects a normal component?"
So the short answer is I don't know, and that's a great complex use case that you would want to probably work with a professional to figure out, is this high risk? Is it not high risk? We talked about the stark difference between being a high risk AI system and not being a high risk AI system. So the question here is, you're part of some manufacturing system that creates a safety component rather than being part of the safety component itself. Yeah, with that nuance, I'm not quite sure. So I would just, I would thank you for this question because I think it's a great example. It demonstrates the fact that you ought to work with someone who really understands your use case and understands these requirements to help you understand if you're affected by the act or not and what your risk level is.
Well, thank you, Bill.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.